So Cantor Barbara Powell will lead us for Havdalah. If you're able, please stand.
Will you be the candle holder?
Sure.
הנה לישועתי יפתח ולא אפחד, כי עוזי בזמרת יד אדוני ויהי לי לישועה. ושבתם מים בששון, ממענה הישועה על אדוני הישועה על עמך וקראתך סלע. אדוני צבאות עמנו, משגב לנו אלוהי יעקב סלע. אדוני צבאות אשרי אדם בוטח בך, אדוני הושיע המלך יעננו ויום קודנו. ליהודים הייתה אורה ושמחה, אורה ושמחה וששון ויקר. ליהודים הייתה אורה ושמחה, אורה ושמחה וששון ויקר. כל ששועות אשא ובשם אדוני אקרא. יאי לה 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 יא לה 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 יא לה לה יא לה לה. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם, בורא פרי הגפן, בורא פרי הגפן. יאי לי לה 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 יא לי לה 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 יא לה לה יא לה לה. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם, בורא מיני ושמים, בורא מיני ושמים. איי 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 לי לה 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 יא לה לה יא לה לה. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם, בורא מאורי האש, בורא מאורי האש. יאי לי לה 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 יאי לה 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 יא לה לה יא לה לה. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם, המבדיל בין קודש לחול, בין אור לחושך, בין ישראל לעמים, בין יום השביעי לששת ימי המעשה. ברוך אתה אדוני המבדיל בין קודש לחול, המבדיל בין קודש לחול, חטאותינו ימחול, שערינו וכספנו ירבה ירבה כחול, בך כוכבים בלילה. שערינו וכספנו ירבה ירבה כחול, בך כוכבים בלילה. שבוע טוב, 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 שבוע טוב. אליהו הנביא, אליהו התשבי, אליהו, אליהו, אליהו הגלעדי, במהרה בימינו יבוא אלינו עם משיח בן דוד, עם משיח בן דוד.
Shavua tov.
שבוע טוב.
Thank you. I do. You should have received study sheets as you came in. Does anyone need? We will give you one.
Turn up the light.
Is there an extra study sheet? We'll give you one. Okay. Lots to go around. I think we're good. Who doesn't have? Good. And for those of you online, it will also be read aloud. So no worries in terms of it. And I know that there are going to be people who are going to want a copy of a study sheet. So just give me a ping after Shabbat and we'll be sure to get it to you. So welcome, everyone. I'm Rabbi Nat Ezra. One of the rabbis here at Congregation Beth Jacob. And I've had this experience the last few years of every time we come back and do something that we had to stop because of COVID, I get emotional. And there's something extraordinary about this North Peninsula Scholar in Residence. It's all of the synagogues and organizations saying, you know what? It's not about my individual place. It's about all of us together. It's about breaking down walls. It's about transcending differences. It's about coming together. And because we've done so many of these, there are a bunch of you who I haven't seen in a long time, who I'm having the chance to see again. And it's just so good to see you. And, you know, always feel welcome at one another's synagogues. And we pray for the success of one another, as well as the wonderful organizations in this area. This event is co-sponsored by the PJCC, Peninsula Temple Beth El, Peninsula Sinai Congregation, Peninsula Temple Shalom, Congregation Beth Jacob, and the Warnock Jewish Day School. It's made possible in part through support of individuals and organizations, including Toby Philanthropies, Corette Foundation, Power in Partnership Fund, and aligned grants programs supporting Bay Area JCCs. Know that it was a value to do this without charge or cost. You should never have to pay to study. And that sense of there are certainly, of course, costs involved makes it appropriate to say that if you would consider it, we would welcome donations at either both Jewish Life at PJCC or your home organization, so we can continue to do this. There are lots of different initiatives that are happening. Outside on the little table is a flyer about the Melton program, another opportunity to learn together as community. The PJCC Jewish Life staff will be teaching the opening 2 classes this spring, and then we'll again involve the other synagogues as we continue to partner together with this. PJCC has this sweet idea, a frequent learner card. And so there are these outside on the little table. Get your little gold star for attending an event. And after you attend 4 of these, there will be a special program just for you. It's nice. It's sweet. There is also a evaluation on the table outside. Evaluations are important. It helps us understand how to improve and do better. We will give you a gold star. There's something nice about gold stars. And also know that there's another lecture tomorrow morning at Beth El at 11 o'clock. It's really nice. It's so nice for the community to get to know somebody. You know how sometimes when you know someone, but they don't really know you, and they've touched you and they don't even know it. I know you, but you don't know me. And you've touched me. I was a student at the University of Judaism, and I went to the library Minyan, This is in the late 80s, and you attended there. And there were times when you taught, and I was so moved by your teaching. And it wasn't just the intellectual depth, which was beautiful, but it was the heart. And I remember saying to myself, you know what? When I'm a rabbi, I want to teach with heart. And a piece of it was learning from you. So I wanted to acknowledge that and share that, because when I went looking to work at a large synagogue with an incredible senior rabbi, I looked for a rabbi who had similar heart. And it's served me well and allowed, hopefully, that to be part of my rabbinate here at Beth Jacob, where I've been for a long time. This is my 28th year here at Beth Jacob. It's a good home. Yeah, that deserves applause. So for those of you who don't know Rabbi Ellenson's bio, he served as the president of Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion, professor emeritus of Near Eastern and Judaic Studies at Brandeis University. He's a leader in the Reform movement, a rabbi's rabbi. He's internationally recognized for his work in areas of Jewish religious thought and ethics, modern Jewish history, emerging trends in American Jewish life. He's an outspoken advocate for religious tolerance and pluralism, both in Israel and within the American Jewish community. He's widely respected for his scholarship, integrity, and respectful discourse. His collaborative leadership has reflected his commitment to advancing Jewish unity. It's really, really a pleasure to welcome you.
Well, let me begin by saying Shavua Tov. It's a pleasure to be here. I think, let me see if I can turn this on. See, my knowledge in regard to technology is just overwhelming. Is this working? Yeah, okay, good. Can I move that? Okay, good. I'll move it down. And I don't need the computer here. It's fine with me. It's just distracting to look at the computer while I'm looking at people. Anyway, it's lovely to see all of you on screen, even if you're blank. But it's really lovely also to see all of you here in person. First, I want to thank the cantor and the rabbi for welcoming me, as they have so many of you. I guess I've seen all during the week. I used to say when I taught at many places, I feel like I've in quotes tortured people in many spots, hopefully educated them, but it means a lot to see again so many of you who've been here all during the last 4 or 5 days. And I want to really once again express my appreciation to Rabbi Matzkin, who really could not have been more gracious in welcoming me here to the community. She has really taken care of every single detail, and I am very appreciative. Even got to have Shabbat dinner with her lovely husband. I guess I can say that. Aviv, usually it's the lovely other spouse. Better be careful about my use of gender here. And they're two terrific boys. Had a very good time with them last night. And I just again want to say thank you. And to your mother, you have every reason to be proud of your daughter, is what I would say. Okay, good. I just figure every parent, it never hurts to say that. I thought about a number of possibilities for this evening. And I do want to indicate for those of you who have been at other lectures that I've been giving over the last few days, this is another one where I'm going to present some chomer, some material. But I want to be honest, I really hope that many of you will express your own views on the topic that we're going to discuss tonight. In many ways, the shiur this evening, the lesson this evening, would be completely appropriate for a time like Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. The question that we're going to deal with, and then I'll put in the historical context that we're looking at, is what happens when someone honestly has done something really terrible, something that perhaps is even unforgivable. How do you then relate to that person later? We're not talking here about an instance where it may be that different people have different ways of viewing a kind of episode. How do you engage, if not in forgiveness, at least reconciliation, or is that desirable? Does there come a moment where you say that, well, what this person did to me, or the act that person performed, is so heinous that they really ought not to be forgiven, or at least I don't have it within me to forgive that person? I bring that up because what we're going to be talking about tonight are two of the greatest intellectual figures of the 20th century. One was Rabbi Leo Baeck. Rabbi Baeck was the last head of the Hochschule, of the liberal rabbinical school in Germany that was destroyed by the Nazis, closed by the Nazis in 1942, but he was also the last duly elected head of the German Jewish community. It was his task during the 1930s and then in the early 1940s to represent the Jewish people with Nazi authorities, Eichmann, Hitler, and others. Think of what it would be to be put in that kind of position if one wants to discuss a task that was literally, as it were, virtually a no-win kind of situation. It was a position in which Rabbi Baeck was put in. And we're going to talk about his relationship, or at least an interaction he had with Carl Jung, the great psychiatrist, who is undoubtedly known to many of you. Indeed, I suspect, is there anyone here who has not heard of Carl Jung before? Okay, so everybody knows who Carl Jung was. Carl Jung in 1933, when the Nazis came to power, wrote a number of pieces in which he expressed pro-Aryan and anti-Jewish sentiments. I mean, this is just on the historical record. There may be debates about was Jung genuinely a Nazi or not, but there is no question that Jung wrote pro-Nazi, racist, anti-Jewish essays. That is unfortunately a part of Carl Jung's legacy. Baeck and Jung had known one another from the 1920s on. They were part of a group called, literally, the Society for Wisdom in Germany. Baeck was, how should I phrase this, a major league intellectual on the German Jewish scene, and he interacted with individuals like Carl Jung. Let me tell you a little bit more about Baeck. Baeck's father was a rabbi. He was born in 1878. He decided to follow his father's footsteps, and he attended the Jewish Theological Seminary in Breslau, where he went for 3 years. In Germany, unlike the United States, rabbis were required to earn a PhD degree in order to be ordained. One of the chief characteristics of the German rabbinate, whether they graduated the Jewish Theological Seminary in Berlin, the Hochschule the Jewish Theological Seminary in Breslau, the Hochschule in Berlin, the liberal rabbinical school that we would think of as parallel to the Hebrew Union College, or the Rabbiner Seminar, the Orthodox Rabbinical Seminary in Germany. All German rabbis were required to earn a PhD degree. By the way, interestingly, it meant that in Berlin, students at the Hochschule of the liberal rabbinical school, and I think about what Rabbi Esri said before, students at the liberal rabbinical school, the Hochschule, and students at the Berlin Rabbiner Seminar would attend their classes at the Hochschule and the Rabbiner Seminar in the morning, and in the afternoons, they'd be together at the University of Berlin. So these people all knew one another. In fact, we have many memoirs from German rabbis where, interestingly, liberal and Orthodox rabbis became socially friendly with one another because they were classmates, and they would go on vacations together. I mention all of this because after 3 years at the Jewish Theological Seminary in Breslau, Baeck transferred to the Hochschule in Berlin. He did this because he wanted to study the philosophy of history with the outstanding intellectual historian, philosopher of history in Germany at that point, a man named Dilthey, D-I-L-T-H-E-Y, and he wrote a doctoral dissertation on Spinoza. And then he ended up getting his semicha from the Hochschule. Again, to give you an idea of how different Germany was, and I've been talking about this with Lori, in America, the conservative movement is an American invention. By an American invention, I mean there was no conservative movement in Germany. In Germany, there was a liberal movement and an Orthodox movement. Graduates of the Theological Seminary and the Hochschule joined the same rabbinical organization. It would be as if in the United States, graduates of the Ziegler School of JTS and HUC all joined one group instead of the RA and the CCAR. In addition, the liberal rabbinate, even the Reform rabbinate in Germany, was much more observant than in America. German Reform rabbis observed kashrut. They did not ride on Shabbat in general. Not in general, they did not ride on Shabbat. I mean, there were exceptions, but the reality is that you can't think of the American scene and project it back into Germany. There were differences that I talked about the other day in terms of the sociology of the American Jewish community with Eastern European and German divisions that led to the creation of a reform movement on the one hand and a conservative movement on the other. But the key point I want to make, and by the way, I should even add at the Hochschule, one of the most famous students at the Hochschule was a man named Abraham Joshua Heschel. When Heschel left Poland and came to study in Germany at the University of Berlin, he completed 6 years of study at the Hochschule. I say this because if the Hochschule had been, I'll be blunt here, like the Hebrew Union College in terms of the observance level, a man like Heschel would never have been comfortable there. But what I want you to understand is then the greater sense of Jewish unity and less denominational division that occurred in Germany as opposed to the United States. Baeck, early on in his career, as both a rabbi and an intellectual, served initially in a small congregation or a small community. Once more, Germany was different because in America, we follow, in quotes, a Protestant model of religious affiliation. We have individual synagogues hire their rabbis, etc. That was not true in Germany. In Germany, you had a Gemeinde, a community, and then you would have individual synagogues, but the rabbis were actually hired by the community, and then they would be paid by the community even as they were assigned to different synagogues. It's a completely different model than the American one. I can just make a comment. If you want to know why I know so much about this, as it were, I spent 50 years of my life studying it. People like Ismar Shorish, who was head of the Jewish Theological Seminary for many, many years. He also worked in this, and one of the great delights of my life always would be to attend academic sessions at the Association for Jewish Studies, where we would deliver learned papers on the German rabbinate in the 19th century. There were at least 10 of us who'd be present at these events. And I won't do this tonight, but there were jokes that would be told that you would have to know who all these figures were to think that they were funny. My own 5 children, when they really want to mock me at some point, will say, "Oh, David, Abba, tell us the joke that Professor Shorish told at the convention." And then it's kind of esoteric. You have to have a certain degree of knowledge to even understand what would be funny about it. But it's my children's way of saying, I can assure you, Abba, however relevant you may think you are, or whatever chokhmah you may think you have to transmit, we're not going to treat you that way at home. And That's for sure. And I'm sure all of you with children have experienced the modesty that they can induce in one through your interactions. There was a man named von Harnack who wrote a book called The Essence of Christianity. Von Harnack was quite liberal, and he had a view of Christianity that in ways parallels more of a Unitarian conception than a Christological conception of the Christian religion. Namely, the way he looked at it was that Christianity was really the embodiment of universal ethics. But in his work, The Essence of Christianity, he caricatured the Jewish religion. The Pharisees were seen as evil. The Pharisees were interested only in strict, dry legalism, as opposed to Jesus, who was the embodiment of being a moral exemplar. Baeck, early on in 1901, shortly after he graduated from the Hochschule and completed his doctorate, wrote an attack or a critique on von Harnack and defended the Jewish religious tradition. And then in 1905, he wrote a book entitled The Essence of Judaism, as opposed to The Essence of Christianity. And the book is about 165 pages, and it is a Hegelian exposition of the Jewish religious tradition. It is philosophically very dense, and in addition to being philosophically dense, what he tries to indicate using Western philosophical categories is that Judaism, the essence of Judaism is that it requires ethical conduct, and he defended Judaism in this way. This catapulted him to fame in the Jewish community, and in 1912, he ultimately was invited to come to Berlin, where he became, in effect, the chief rabbi of Berlin. In addition to serving as a congregational rabbi, he was a great, great scholar. He wrote on any number of topics, and he wrote a great deal on contrasting Judaism and Christianity. He wrote a great deal on Midrash, and he also became head of the Hochschule. He became head of the liberal rabbinical school. So think of an individual who is running a pulpit full time, and then in addition becomes head of one of the major, if not the major, rabbinical schools in Germany during this period. I'm looking at my friends from time in Los Angeles. It would be as if Brad Artson or Elliot Dorff were head of the rabbinical school, which Brad is, Rabbi Artson is at Ziegler School, and then in addition was also the chief rabbi at David Wolpe's congregation. Give me the name. What? Sinai. I mean, he was doing all these things simultaneously. In addition, he became head of the B'nai B'rith fraternal order in Germany during this period. He had a lot of energy, is all I can really say. And he was a person apparently of impeccable manners and civility. He was the embodiment in Germany, they would call it, he was the embodiment of the educational ideal of Bildung. Bildung means sort of ethical character cultivation. During World War I, he served as a chaplain in the Jewish army, or in the German army. And after the war, he rewrote his book. The Essence of Judaism. And what's interesting is the second edition of The Essence of Judaism is over 320 pages. And what is different in the second edition is he basically adds 165 pages of biblical, midrashic, and rabbinic sources. Leo Baeck, B-A-E-C-K. Leo Baeck we're talking about. Okay, any other question here? Okay, so we're talking about Rabbi Baeck because I want to give you a full biography of his. He also began to deliver lectures at this point, and his religious ideology changed. He made the point that in Judaism, there's a religion, as it were, of two poles, which serve as the foundations for Jewish religious faith. He distinguished between, or not between, he said both of these are parts of our tradition, Geheimnis und Gebot. Geheimnis means mystery. I should show you I got a PhD and learned to read German. Geheimnis is mystery, and Gebot is commandment. He said that within Judaism, every single commandment is embedded in the mystery of God. In other words, he begins to introduce not only the idea of Gebot, the ethical commandment that Jews are required to observe, but that these commandments are anchored in the reality of a God. And this God can't be fully explicated in rational kinds of categories. By the time he's in the 1920s, then, he is a major figure on the German Jewish scene and within the whole larger German intellectual scene. And it's at this point that he first comes to be a friend of Carl Jung's. And the two of them, if not close friends, at least are colleagues with one another in the highest, I would say, intellectual echelons or circles of German life. And then the Holocaust comes. The interesting thing about the German Jewish community in 1933, when Hitler came to power, it needed to elect a leader. And I think this says a lot about our people, and it says a lot about the German Jewish community. They could have turned to politicians. They could have turned to businessmen because it was men gendered at that point. The community overwhelmingly and virtually unanimously selected a rabbi. They wanted Leo Baeck to be their representative. Leo Baeck represented more than anyone the unity of the Jewish people in Germany during this horrific hour. If we had more time to focus on Baeck, there are episodes in which Baeck has been castigated, and there are other people who simply only praise Baeck for what he had done. Baeck, I will say, was not a saint, but what he proved to be was genuinely a rabbi. When Rabbi Esri made the point a few moments ago about what one would aspire to be, as a rabbi, I will tell you, Leo Baeck represents who and what I would like to be as a rabbi. I mean, I have thought about him virtually my whole life. He led the community during the 1930s. He left Germany more than 15 times on kinder transport. You're probably all familiar with that. These were ways in which Jewish children in Germany would be brought to England to safety. Jews throughout the world begged Rabbi Baeck to leave Germany. The Jewish Theological Seminary, the Hebrew Union College, universities like the University of Chicago and others, all offered him positions. He could have gone to England. Baeck would not leave Germany. He said on any number of occasions, I cannot leave my people until the final solution comes to an end. And part of why Baeck's life, in my opinion, shines out in a commanding way to us is not that he was a saint and not that he did not make decisions that perhaps were incorrect. Although I will say, I always think of the rabbinic phrase, Al tadun et chavercha ad shetagia limkomo. Put yourself back in Nazi Germany in 1938, 39, 40, and you tell me what the right thing to do was if you were the leader of the community. I would always hope that the people who are critical of decisions Baeck made have at least some degree of humility and thank God that most of us are never put in this kind of life or death position. Baeck ultimately in 1942 was incarcerated, or 1942 was incarcerated in Theresienstadt. How many of you have visited Theresienstadt? So a number of you have. Baeck lost 4 brothers in Auschwitz and Birkenau. He went with 3 of his sisters. He was incarcerated in Theresienstadt. 3 of his sisters, they all died there. He was the only one to survive at the age of 70. His job in the concentration camp, remember, Theresienstadt was the model concentration camp where the Nazis would bring visiting dignitaries in order to prove that that which was occurring in Germany was not so horrific. So at the age of 70, he was frankly transformed into being a garbage man, or the equivalent of a horse who would pull a wagon. Namely, his job every day in the camp was to push the garbage cans and to collect the garbage, the refuse. We have many stories and even drawings from inmates at Teresian where every evening, or at least several times a week, Baeck would lecture by heart on topics like midrash, philosophy, and other subjects to the inmates in Teresian. These were people who were befouling themselves as they had to stand in line because there wasn't enough bathroom facilities for them. These people would sacrifice hours late at night just to hear Leo Baeck speak. And that's because Baeck succeeded in reminding them of the dignity that they had inherently as human beings. In other words, this isn't akin to, I don't know, French nobles dancing a minuet as they're about to go to the guillotine. Leo Baeck was able to remind them that they were human. And one often forgets how many German Christians were incarcerated in these camps because they had a speck of Jewish blood in them. In other words, you had individuals who for 3 generations had not been Jewish, but because they had Jewish blood, they were defined by the Nazis' racist laws as Jews. And these people too were often brought into the camps. And even unlike the Jews, they didn't have the solidarity even of knowing that they had an identity as Jews until this event occurred. Baeck would actually serve as a pastor to these individuals as well. Finally, World War II comes to an end, and Baeck is the only surviving member of his family. So now imagine it's 1945, 1946. Baeck is alive. His sisters, brothers have all died. His wife died before the war. His community has been destroyed by the Nazis. His school and other sister rabbinical schools had all been destroyed. And Baeck is called upon at this point. He moves to London. And Baeck is made part of a 3-person team that's going to decide how the Jewish communities of Europe will be reconstructed. And he also becomes part of the Jewish Claims Conference, which begins to deal with the fact, what do we do with the cultural treasures of the German Jewish community? There was a team of 3 people who were assigned the responsibility of deciding this. One was Salo Baron, might be a name known to some of you. Dr. Baron taught at Columbia University and was arguably the greatest Jewish historian of the 20th century. So many of us have received our doctorates from Columbia because, quite frankly, Dr. Baron taught at Columbia and made Columbia the center of Jewish studies in the United States for decades. So you had Salo Baron, you had a man named Gershon Scholem. To say a man named Gershon Scholem was the greatest scholar in the world of Jewish mysticism and Baeck. The 3 of them were the people who decided how the legacy of German Jewry, the intellectual legacy, would be divided. And these texts, et cetera, these books were divided mostly in the United States between or among Yeshiva University, the Jewish Theological Seminary, and Hebrew Union College in London, and then in Israel. Many of these documents went to the library of the Sifriya Le'umit, the National Library of the Jewish people in Jerusalem. Baeck and Scholem became very, very close friends. Scholem, of course, had made Aliyah to Eretz Yisrael in the 1920s. He headed the Jewish Thought Department at the Hebrew University. When Baeck would go to Israel, he would be hosted by Scholem. The 2 of them were extremely close to one another. They worked together, they respected one another. And now we get to 1946. So this is a year after Baeck has a year after Beck has been released from the concentration camp, and think of what he's experienced. Carl Jung approaches him, and he wants to ask Beck for forgiveness, but in addition, and there's an article that was written by Paul Mendesflor, who is a colleague and a friend of mine. Paul taught at Hebrew University, or teaches, well, he's retired now, emeritus, at Hebrew University and at the University of Chicago. We wrote an introduction to a lecture that Beck gave at an event called the Oranos Conference in 1947 in Switzerland. And what I'm about to present tonight is the backdrop for this. The Oranos Conference was an extremely, extremely prestigious conference on religion, spirituality, and ethics, in which the greatest scholars in the world participated. And Jung was the person who organized this in 1947. He invited Beck, or he wanted Beck to come and speak at the conference. Beck personally held German Christian Protestant intellectuals like Jung. He felt they were particularly culpable, particularly guilty for the rise of National Socialism. His position was that these intellectuals had a duty in 1932-33 to speak out against Nazism, and their failure to do so was a colossally immoral act on their part. Beck therefore refused to speak with Jung. Jung continued to approach him, continued to invite him. He wanted to speak and he wanted to apologize to him. And Beck refused to do it. Beck happened to be in Switzerland, in Zurich, at a hotel where Jung was in 1946. And Jung sent a message to the hotel saying, I would like to speak with you and I'd like to apologize. And Beck just said no, said, I can't meet with you. Jung came over to the hotel, came downstairs, called Beck on the phone, and begged Beck to meet with him. And at that point, Beck yielded. And what we have before us, and I want to emphasize something, Beck himself never wrote about this chapter. The only thing we know about it is a letter written by Gershon Scholem, his friend, to Carl Jung's secretary, who was preparing the letters of Carl Jung. She had known about Beck meeting with Jung, and she wanted to know what Gershon Scholem, what light could he cast on the event? This was already in the 1960s. Beck had died in 1956. So what we're about to look at is what Gershon Scholem wrote about the incident. But we do know this much. Beck did deliver the lecture in 1947. The lecture was entitled Individuum Ineffable, the ineffable human being, the ineffable individual. Usually we use ineffability to talk about God. Beck talked about it in terms of humanity. And just as Beck in 1923 had said, commandment isn't enough. We need to understand that mystery is part of the reality of Jewish existence. In this book, or in this lecture, he foreshadows a book that he would write that would be published in 1948 called This People Israel. By this point, Beck has moved in his thought from talking about the essence of Judaism in philosophical terms to saying, if what you want to do is understand Judaism as a religion, you have to begin with the people Israel. This people Israel, which is published in 1948, is foreshadowed by the lecture that he gives at the Oranos Conference. And in this lecture and in the book, Beck, interestingly, comes to the conclusion that the holiest act a Jew can perform is to give birth to a child or to educate a child. Because the point that Beck makes is that no matter how horrific life is, The decision to have and rear an educated child is an enunciation of a confidence that Lomrot HaKol, despite everything, the world is good and the world has positive possibilities. And remember, he's writing this 2 to 3 years after he has been literally in hell. He has literally been in hell, and this is what he writes in these years. And I won't go into it now, but I will say at the naming ceremonies for our children, we have often taken sections from This People Israel, where he talks about what a child means, that every child, when they come into the world, also represents a question that God poses. And the answer to that question, namely, what does it mean to be human, is revealed in the life that that child will one day lead, that each of us offers testimony, as it were, to the challenge that God places before all of us as to what the quality of our life will be, ethically and in every other way. And so that Baeck ends this by saying, people are not born into community as if by fate. Namely, the way the world exists isn't just a matter of fate or destiny, but rather God calls each person to the task of molding the world. This is part of why Baeck commanded the respect that he did of particularly the German Jewish community, so that when the German Jewish community decided to preserve its culture after World War II, the major cultural institution of German Jewry, its legacy, is the Leo Baeck Institute. Who else would you name it after? The Leo Baeck Temple, the Leo Baeck Day School, the Leo Baeck School in Haifa. He may not be quite as prominent as people like Buber or Rosenzweig or other thinkers, but the reality is, as a human being, there is no one who probably represents the essence of what it can mean to be both a rabbi and a person, to be one in both spirit and one in intellect, as Leo Baeck did. Leo Baeck agrees finally to meet with Jung. And by the way, in the history of the Uranus Conference, which exists to this day, as far as I know, there have only been 3 Jews who ever spoke at it: Leo Baeck, Martin Buber, and Gershon Scholem. I mean, it's like talking about the Lehrhaus in Frankfurt. First head of the Lehrhaus in Frankfurt was Franz Rosenzweig. Second head of the Lehrhaus was Martin Buber. And the third head of the Lehrhaus was Abraham Joshua Heschel. So if you're talking about replacing people, and I loved your comment before, Rabbi Esri, how many years here? 28. You know, it's a little bit like, I taught at Hebrew Union College from 79 to 2001. I couldn't get another job. I just ended up being at Hebrew Union. So ultimately they made me president. I mean, that was probably how it evolved. I just couldn't find another job. Or one could say that one was beloved and happy where one was. But okay, we'll go with that one. I like that one too. I'll take that for my own career. So with this said, what I want you to read is the letter that Gershon Scholem wrote to Anelia Jaffe. And if you would take out this paper, and if you want to read all about Baeck's life, which I've summarized here, you can read the short article, 10 pages, by my standards, that's short, that Paul and I wrote as an introduction to this essay. But I want to read this story and I want to ask the following question. What would you have done if you were Leo Baeck? And when I say that, I honestly want to say to you, I don't know if I would have done what Baeck did. And I don't want to call it a lesson on forgiveness completely. The question is, what does happen if you can't forgive someone? Can you at least reconcile and live with them? And when I tell you I do not have the answer to this, I really do not. And I'm hoping that in the discussion, and certainly ask any questions you want about Baeck, but what I'm really hoping in the discussion is to hear from you how it is you feel about what Baeck did, or to put it another way, what would happen if you were in this kind of position? What do you think you might have done? I don't know if I could have done what Baeck did. I'm going to be honest, but let's look at the letter. Dear Mrs. Jaffe, sorry. Dear Mrs. Jaffe, as you are so interested in the story of Baeck and Jung, in other words, Jung's secretary has written to Sholem saying, what was the deal? I know something happened between the two of them. Can you tell me? And again, I want to reiterate for probably the 15th time in this talk, Baeck never wrote about this. We don't have one word from Baeck about this encounter, which is rather interesting when you think about it. I will write it down for your benefit, and I have no objection to being cited by you in this matter. And this letter from Sholem appears in a volume of letters dealing with Carl Jung. In the summer of 1947, Leo Baeck was in Jerusalem. I had then just received for the first time an invitation to the Uranus meeting in Ascona. This is all in Switzerland, outside of Zurich. Evidently at Jung's suggestion, and I asked Baeck whether I should accept it, as I had heard and read many protests about Jung's behavior in the Nazi period. By the way, Baeck would write later, I mean, this much we do know, he was shocked to know what Jung had written, because he had had very cordial relationships with him, and there was nothing about Jung's behavior in the 1920s or prior to the rise of Nazism that ever made him think that Baeck had pejorative views in relationship to Jews or kind of racist Aryan proclivities. And Baeck said to me, you must go, absolutely. And in the course of our conversation, he told me the following story. He, Baeck, had also been put off by Jung's reputation from those well-known articles in the years 1933 to 1934. I mean, this we have records of. These pro-Aryan, anti-Jewish, racist statements on the part of Jung. Jung did say later that he imagined that Hitler, or he hoped that Hitler would somehow bring healing to Germany. And I do want to say in his defense, several years later, he ceased to be a member of the Nazi Party, but it is true, in these early years, his record is not blameless, to put it rather mildly. Because he knew Jung very well from the Darmstadt meetings of the Society of Wisdom, and he would never have credited him with any Nazi or anti-Semitic sentiments. When after his release from Theresienstadt, Baeck returned to Switzerland for the first time, and Sholem writes, I think it was 1946, and therefore he did not call on Jung in Zurich. But it came to Jung's ears that Baeck was in the city. Jung sent a message begging him to visit him, which he, Baeck, declined because of Jung's actions, Jung's writings. Therefore, Jung came to his hotel, and eventually they had an extremely lively talk lasting 2 hours, during which Baeck reproached him with all the things that he had heard about Jung during these years. Jung defended himself by an appeal to the special conditions in Germany, but he at the same time confessed to him, well, I slipped up. And in the article that Paul and I have, you don't have to take it out now, we have a footnote. This German, which means I slipped up, in Swiss German, it has an entirely different meaning than in English when you translate it that way. I slipped up in Swiss German, where you have narrow mountain paths, means I could plunge to death. It's much more serious, and maybe we shouldn't have even translated it as I slipped up. It has a much more serious kind of meaning in Swiss German, probably referring to the Nazis and his expectation that something great might after all emerge. The remark I slipped up, which Beck repeated to me several times, remains vividly in memory. Beck said that in his talk, they cleared everything up that had come between them, and they parted from one another, reconciled again. Because of this explanation of Beck's, I, Gershon Scholem, accepted the invitation to come to Oranos when the invitation came a second time. So now, my nafka mineh, what is it we learn from this?
Well, you know what kind of situation?
Oh, do you want to get, okay.
Say the Shema.
It's on.
Okay. So when we say the Shema, Shema Yisrael, to me that means listen deeply. Listen to the thinking under the words. As you just did as an example, you explained to us, it says, well, I slept. Well, it doesn't say, well, I slept. When you talk about the mountain pass and the danger of passing, you could fall over the cliff to your death. So it's the listening. So I'm imagining these two people had a conversation, but
Yes.
perhaps, I mean, he's a psychiatrist. Jung is a psychiatrist. So perhaps they're listening to each other very deeply and considering the circumstances. And can I really imagine that Hitler would be so crazy? I mean, it's really hard to imagine.
Okay, other people want to comment about this? Any thoughts, responses, feelings? Yeah, Alan?
When I read this and listen to your description, I try to realize that I'm looking at this decades later.
Right.
And okay, so there's some parts that Beck knew and Jung knew that I know, that they each knew and experienced that I've learned third hand years later. So I'm comfortable with Beck's rejection to say, given what I know about this guy, I'm going to formally not reconcile with him, and knowing he's a talented person doesn't fix it for me. But I might say then, I appreciate he still contributes to the to the world. It's just what he did that affects my world doesn't justify that.
Does that mean then you would have spoken or you would not have spoken?
I would not have spoken.
You would not have spoken. Any other? Yeah.
So a question comes to mind. Did Jung do teshuvah here?
Well, at least according to Gershon Scholem, he, to some degree, said he was sorry. To some degree, what is the line here? Beck reproached him and he said, well, you have to understand that. He said, yes, I did make a big mistake. I don't know, does that constitute teshuvah or not? By the way, one of the points I want to make here is that when you're dealing with cases like this, and I think about it in terms of Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, often, of course, we think, and you have to consider who you are as a person, we think about what is it that we've done that would have made us better. But in a case like this, what do you do when someone really has wronged you? It's not always so easy to forgive. I mean, our tradition may teach that after 3 times, if a person is sincere, you're required to forgive them. But the reality is, what if someone really has done you wrong? And I want to therefore make a distinction, and part of why I named this lecture reconciliation and or forgiveness. I have no idea if Beck ever forgave him. but he reconciled, at least to a degree, that he could interact with him.
Yeah, I have a few things I want to say, and I've studied Jung for many years, beginning in high school, because I had an elder friend who was a lay analyst, and she went to Zurich, etc. I have an article here from Dr. Aryeh Mandelbaum. You know Dr. Mandelbaum?
No, I don't.
He is the co-director of the New York Center for Jungian Studies, a Jungian in private practice in New York City. And in this long article, he has the statement of what one of what Jung wrote. Would you like to hear that?
Sure.
Okay. The state of psychotherapy today, which discussed the differences between what he called the Jewish psychology and the German psychology. The Jewish race as a whole, Jung wrote, possesses an unconscious, which can be compared with the Aryan, only with reserve. Creative individuals apart, the average Jew is far too conscious and differentiated to go about pregnant with the tensions of unborn futures. The Aryan unconscious has a higher potential than the Jewish. That is both the advantage and the disadvantages of a youthfulness not yet fully weaned from barbarism. Anyway, what I will say along these lines is this writer goes on, the Jungian says, while many Jewish Jungians were and are offended by Jung's insensitivity to the plight of Jews during that decade and disappointed by his failure to speak out against anti-Semitism, they generally did not consider Jung anti-Semitic on a personal level. And also, there's so much in this article. A good friend and one-time Jung's dentist, who ultimately became a Jungian analyst, wrote, I have written in my long life many books, and I have already written nonsense. Unfortunately, that article is nonsense. But what I did want to say about it is it would be impossible for me personally to forgive him for that. On the other hand, he loved Kabbalah. And there's so many statements, I have several of them that Jung wrote about Kabbalah, and I would pick out some of the goodness in Jung and I wouldn't turn my back on him. However, this was, grievous. It was absolutely horrible. Okay. And I just want to close with saying something about Rabbi Joe Asher, who was the rabbi at Temple Emmanuel. And Joe Asher went to Germany. Maybe you know this already, but I don't know if people do. Joe Asher, rabbi at Temple Emmanuel, went to Berlin, and he said he would forgive the Nazis. Okay. And it was a controversial article that appeared in Life magazine when it existed. And there was an outcry in San Francisco, which I witnessed, and it just raised a huge question. I had many talks with Rafi Asher, Rabbi Rafi, who was a good friend of mine. So I could go on and on. I will stop, but it's all interesting.
I think the key point is here, you talk about someone like Rabbi Joseph Asher. Asher was ordained as an Orthodox rabbi and comes from a German background of devout Orthodoxy. Ultimately, as you know, he became probably the most classical Reform rabbi in the Bay Area. How should I put it? And Rafi, his son, was my classmate at Hebrew Union College. I wrote an essay to honor Rabbi Asher when he was at Emmanuel in San Francisco. He probably, on a personal level, he became about as anti-ritualistic as anyone could be, meaning in terms of the observance of traditional kashrut and halachot, etc. Rabbi Asher, probably only someone raised in a very thoroughly Orthodox background would ever have rebelled in that way to the extent that Rabbi Asher did. Though interestingly, two of Rabbi Asher's great students who grew up at Temple Emmanuel, many of you may know, one is Rabbi Brad Artson, who was confirmed at Emmanuel, and the other, Rabbi Devorah Weisberg, who did her PhD in Talmud at the Jewish Theological Seminary and then was ordained at Hebrew Union and is head of the rabbinical school at Hebrew Union. So he clearly produced some very outstanding Talmidim and Talmidot. But I think the key point is, and I'm really just raising this here, I'm again trying to be blunt, or honest, I don't actually have a conclusion. I will say to you, I admire Baeck for being able to do this. I don't know myself what I would have done. Let's hear from some other people. And we'll get to you in one moment. We'll move around. Rabbi, I'm going to have to ask you for help in this. Why don't you hand it to this young woman and let her speak next, and then we'll come over here and the woman in the orange, or maybe Lord, either one of you. This is what you're really trained to do in rabbinical school, right? This is what it means. This is what it means to serve our people. Yes.
So I have a question about whether, as a representative of the Jewish community of Germany, he had the right to forgive Leo Baeck, because Leo Baeck, I don't mean
Carl
Leo-
Jung.
Carl Jung, because his crime is to the whole Jewish people of Germany and not just to Leo Baeck.
Yeah, I want to make one point here. Nowhere in here is it stated that he forgave him. Doesn't state that he forgave him. What he did do, he spoke at a conference where he was invited. And in that sense, he becomes emblematic. And certainly Baeck is a major individual and figure. It's not like a private citizen doing something like this. So I think the implication of what you say is there. I mean, I think I can say this. I initially shared this article with my friend, and I'm sure many of you know her, Deborah Lipstadt. And Deborah Lipstadt reacted to this, Ambassador Lipstadt, I love calling her that. She responded to it in exactly the way that you did, though she called me several days later and said she'd been thinking about it. And of course, the reality is, look at what Baeck lived through. And she decided that in her own mind, she would just, as it were, withhold judgment. She doesn't know if she could have done it. But I do want to emphasize, it never says that he forgave him for what he did. What he did do, and that's why I use the term reconciliation, he reconciled enough that he at least spoke at this conference for him. Yeah.
Thank you. I think you just said what I was going to say, which is that what I was reading was reconciled, which to me does not mean forgiveness at all. And I think about my own husband, who was a Holocaust survivor, who would speak to German people or teach young German people when he went to Berlin what it was like, because their parents or grandparents would never talk to them about it. But it wasn't like he felt that he had forgiven
Right.
people, and he
Interesting.
still was cautious and suspicious and whatnot. So I think it's a different.
I'm going to ask you, Rabbi, over here. She's been waiting a long time.
Well, I just would like to know, during those years, was Young a member of the party? Did he?
He was, well,
Did
in
he-
the very beginning, he was, but he dropped out. He dropped out by 35, 36.
But was he in cahoots, say with some of those people what they were going to do going forward? Was he
Well, I
aware
don't know.
of what was
No.
going to happen?
No, what he did actually, what was read over here, the major thing was he had written these articles about the superiority of the Aryan to the Jew. That was the major thing he did.
Yeah.
But after a while, I want to be fair, he dropped out.
Mhm.
Okay, now we have over here, and then we'll get to the back row. Just remember, those of you in the back, the Hebrew phrase, acharon, acharon chaviv, the ones at the end are the most beloved. So although we love all of you at the beginning too, I better watch how I say this. Okay.
I've been thinking about this post World War II. People have to survive and pursue whatever their occupation is or their dream is. So Jung wants to survive in the psychiatric community, and it is heavily focused on Jews. So I question
Oh,
his motives
yeah.
for seeking forgiveness. And then in regards to Leo Baeck, in his soul, he could never carry hatred.
Mm.
So he could never cause pain. And I think he could justify meeting with Jung.
Yeah,
on
by
that.
the way, I mean, one point that I do want to make here, is that there are kind of two issues. One is actually the historical case. In other words, what were Jung's motives, et cetera. Let's assume, though, for a moment, and this is part of what I hope you'll think about tonight, is that in part we are really focusing on two historical figures. But the other part that I want to emphasize to you is think about it from your own perspective. That is to say, not in regard to someone who wrote the kind of statements that Jung wrote in the 1930s. I would hope that each and every one of us, when I read this, I think in my own life, no one has ever done to me anything remotely approaching this event. I mean, I can't even begin to describe it. But having said that, what do you do in your own life? I mean, you're going to come up to Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur again. And I'm sure every single one of you has somebody who you think done me wrong. I mean, I don't know any other way to put it than that. How are you going to respond to that person? And how is it you ever know completely what their motives are and what's your relationship to them? In other words, part of what I think the value of this isn't only the historical context in which this encounter emerges, but what does it just say to each and every one of us as we think about forgiveness and reconciliation in our own life? So now we have a lot of people, and then we'll get back to the front, but Rabbi, maybe from the back. Oh, okay, sorry. We'll get to you, I promise.
Well, thank you. That was a great introduction to what I wanted to say, which is, I think in this conversation, we have to think about defining our terms. I think that terms like forgiveness and reconciliation are very personal things that have different meaning for every person. And what does that encompass for you? If I forgive you, does that mean I trust you? Does it mean I have to learn to get along with you because we live in the same world together and, you know, we have to be peacemakers? There's a lot to unpack in our terminology and to recognize, I think most importantly, that it's very personal for each individual.
Good, thank you.
Thanks.
So almost playing on that, does forgiveness or even reconciliation equate to justification or excusing? He may have reconciled and, you know, maybe if someone's done wrong, if I want to forgive them, I'm in the process of dealing with something too, but I know for my own health and my own well-being, it's better at some point, therapy, blah, 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 but to work through all of it and to leave the dreck away so that
That's a technical psychological
Yes, it is,
term.
I'm sure.
Yes, okay.
You know, so that I can move on and I can live my life. It doesn't excuse what they did, but I may come to a reconciliation. Forget, you know, again, agree. Forgive. What does it mean to forgive? But it also, I don't think I will ever, you know, I can imagine Beck where I don't think I would ever excuse. You did it. You have to bear responsibility for it. You said you slipped, you erred, but so on that personal level, what, you know, what's the slippery slope? I might reconcile, especially for my own health, but I'm never going to completely excuse it. So I think,
Yeah, by the way, keep in mind the story of Cain and Abel. After his brother is killed, God puts a mark on Cain. He can really never forget what he did to his brother, that he committed an act of fratricide. That is a sign that he carries with him for the rest of his life. And at the same time, the Torah teaches us that Cain becomes ultimately a boneh arim, that Cain becomes a builder of cities, though the scar as a sign or a reminder of what he did is never erased. We're gonna, there are a couple people in the back and then we'll get up to the front.
I've been thinking about this question for a long time. My father was a refugee from Germany. He was a kinder on the kinder transport. And he had a burning fire of hatred for Germany till the day he died, boycotted German goods.
Right.
Spoke at shuls all over New Jersey, where I grew up, about the complicity of the Catholic Church. That was one of his favorite themes. And I would have a lot of intellectual discussions with him and, you know, why not this? Why not that? Would you consider? And it was just visceral. It was visceral,
Yes.
and I approached it intellectually. And so I couldn't quite, I mean, we were very close, but I couldn't feel the intensity that he felt. After he died, I found some old pictures. Came from a very large family, and there was a photograph, and there's Tante Johanna and Tante Regina and Uncle Ludwig and all this. And then he wrote in the back, all of them murdered by the Nazis.
Yeah.
May they and their descendants burn in hell
Hell.
eternally. And I saw that in my 50s, and it chilled me because he never reached what Leo Baeck would have reached, whom he admired greatly, and he could never break free of that animus and that intensity.
Yeah, and it goes back then to the comment, what happens when, to you, not just in regard to this, when you can't abandon that kind of animus. I mean, I will say on a personal level, no reason for you to know, but I mean, I devote tons of time to writing about German Jews. I am devoted to deceased Yekas. I write about them all the time. Part of the reason I do it, I talked about this morning, is it was in Germany that the whole dialectic between what does it mean to be Jewish and modern, i.e., how do we adapt to living in a larger culture and at the same time attain or retain, express our authenticity as Jews. Part of it is that it serves as an historical model for me. But the other thing is, if I could speak as a rabbi for a moment, and I don't write about this as an academic, I regard my writing on all these 19th century figures, when I write about Osriel Hildesheimer, Zachariah Frankel, Abraham Geiger, these names probably aren't even known to many of you, I actually bring them back to life. That is to say, if I didn't write about them in the way that I did, or another way to phrase it is, I actually make them accessible. I let them speak, and we learn their lessons today, and otherwise they'd be silent. So in part, I engage in the particular academic work I do, because on a personal, emotional level, I have a strong commitment to letting their voices be heard once again. And through me, they speak, or to quote our tradition, Siftotav Devavot Mina Kever, their lips move, as it were, silently from the graves, from their eternal resting place, and they speak in the 20th and 21st centuries later on through the work that I attempt to do. Here we have in the front row, or you're going to speak.
I was, yeah, but she was first, that's why.
Ah, okay.
It's just the way it worked. I'm thinking back to your talk today, this morning, for those who missed it. I'll just quickly summarize about the history of Zionism and the idea that Enlightenment was followed by the romantic period. They were going from a period of valuing reason to valuing emotion.
Right.
And if you look at Germany up through the 1920s, even in the early 1930s, you had the Hitler movement, which was fundamentally a romantic movement.
Yes.
Right. And the academic world that existed, and if you look at Germany in that period outside of what the Nazis were, it was an egalitarian, enlightened society.
In theory, yes.
Well, in theory, right.
Yeah.
And in fact, you talked about Herzl experiencing this feeling of betrayal in France.
Yes.
That much more so, all the Germans who couldn't imagine, couldn't fathom that Germany that they had served in World War I,
Yeah.
that they had lived in their homes and in their stores and in their lives, that they were Germans. Right? Then my grandfather, who was a traveling salesman, told me the story that he was going from place to place, and his customers in 34 were telling him, get out. The party members were telling him to get out because they knew where this was going. So many people didn't, and so many people didn't believe it. And I think the challenge of the romantic movement is that all of us can get swept up by it.
Yeah.
And I look at this and I think not that Beck was forgiving Jung, but Jung wanted to be heard. And Beck finally said, if he really wants to be heard, I'm willing to listen. Nothing else beyond that. And everything that happened there, it sounds like it didn't have to be anything more than that. But the fact that in the end, he wanted to be heard and wanted to say some form of, I was wrong, there's a whole nation of Germany that's saying that today, right? I've been to Germany, and when I
Right.
come back and tell people that I'm the grandson of and son of people, my mom was in 6 months old when she left. You know, part of me still thinks of the Germany that was denied me, because it was apparently up until 33 a great place. For whatever it's
More or
worth.
less. yeah,
More or less,
yeah.
yeah. We'll leave it at that. Anyway, I just want to say that because I think that this idea of rationality and reason versus this emotion that overcomes reason, this is the human, this is the human struggle that we constantly go through, and it has horrible consequences when emotion takes over. That's what I want to share.
Yeah. And I want to even apologize for the way I responded to that, because the problem is, because we know what happened. Ultimately, we know in quotes how bad it became. And so the people appear to be blind or myopic to us. But you're right. In 32, I wouldn't have thought this.
So, we're talking about this philosophically, whether Beck reconciled, forgave, what it is that happened. What strikes me about this is that the writer, Gershom Scholem, he spends a lot of time giving the background, but he says very, very little of what really took place at that meeting. It's almost in passing. They sat down, they finally talked, they reconciled, so I'll agree to speak at your conference. And you don't get any sense at all of what really took place in that discussion. And I would expect that either Leo Baeck just didn't want to discuss it in any detail, or Gershom Scholem didn't want to let it out in any detail. And you know how you have the white spaces in the Torah. There's just a ton of white spaces here, and I'm really wondering what really did happen.
Yeah, what you have here is a lot of frustration, and I think actually your analog here about the white spaces in the Torah, so to speak, there is a play, I think it's called The Rabbi and the Psychiatrist, which is written by two Jewish psychiatrists that attempts to imagine what the conversation was between Beck and Jung. But I want to emphasize this is built entirely out of the minds of these two psychiatrists. And in fact, after Paul Mendesflor and I wrote this article, I heard from them, and they wrote to me, and it's on YouTube. I mean, I'll again try to give it to Lori so she could have the reference to it. But your point is well taken. It is completely a play that is written by these two men. We don't have any idea, and I think it's of what actually occurred. And I think it says a lot. I hadn't thought about Scholem before, but the fact is Beck himself just never writes about this. And you have to wonder in part, or at least I wonder, why he did not. In 2 hours.
I mean, I would think that if Beck agreed to have this meeting, he probably had a very high moral high ground, probably gave Jung a great deal of a piece of his mind in no uncertain terms, and told him what a piece of garbage was. And the guy properly should have been reduced to groveling.
Well, and he may have been, but we don't know that, and I therefore can't fill it in. Let's just have a couple more comments from people. Okay, here, and then we'll get Aviv. But why don't we start here? Oh, I was going to let. Oh, okay.
Marshall.
I don't think that Beck had the right to forgive Jung. Only God could forgive him. And I just don't think that he had that power.
Yeah, some of you, well, I don't know that he did forgive him. I mean, we don't know that he forgave him.
Yeah.
I do want to say in this regard, I mean, many of you have probably read, I think it's called The Sunflower by, who was the author? Wiesenthal wrote it. And, you know, there's a famous story in this that the Chafetz Chaim, who was a great scholar in Europe, He was on a train, according to the story, and there were individuals who wished to play a game of cards, and he's in the wagon with him. By the way, I think the story's been told in several girsaot, several versions, thank you, several texts on this. And the individuals keep screaming and yelling at him the whole time, like, what's wrong? You're too good to play cards with us. They have no idea who he is. Finally, they arrive in the city, and just as you all do on the peninsula, when your rabbis arrive after a journey, the entire town is there to greet the rabbi, because you want the rabbi or the cantor to understand how much they're treasured by everyone. Suddenly, the men who've been insulting and screaming at this rabbi during the entire trip go over to him and say, oh my God, I can't tell you how sorry I am. The way I behaved towards you on the train was literally unforgivable. Please, please forgive me. Won't you forgive me? And the Chafetz Chaim, who's the greatest Jewish moralist in the world, says, no, I won't forgive you. They come to him again. Please, please forgive me. And the response is, no, I won't forgive you. And finally, they come the third time, and he still won't forgive them. At this point, the men who've been insulting him say to him, how can you not forgive me? Jewish law is clear. If I come to you 3 times and I tell you that I'm genuinely sorry, you have a chiyuv, you have an halachic obligation to forgive. So why won't you forgive me? And then finally, at this point, the Chafetz Chaim says, I'm not the one you insulted. This is now like a Zen riddle. What do you mean I'm not the one you insulted? Aren't I the person that, I mean, aren't you the individual? I was nearly beating on you. I was screaming at you. I was cursing at you. And again, the Chafetz Chaim says, no, it wasn't me. And finally, at that point, these men say to the Chafetz Chaim, you're going to have to explain this to me. And he said, the person you were berating and the person you were insulting was not the Chafetz Chaim. It was rather a person you thought, or it was an anonymous individual that you thought had no standing and no import whatsoever. If what you want is forgiveness, don't come to me, because you didn't insult the Chafetz Chaim. Find someone who you think is of absolutely no import in the world and ask that person for forgiveness. Namely, the key point is, how does one engage in forgiveness? And I do want to at least emphasize, I have no reason to think reading this that anybody forgave anyone. But I do know that he spoke, and I'll talk to that again in a moment as we conclude. But, oh yes, oh, you wanted to
I
continue.
see this in
apologize.
terms of a play.
What?
I'm a fiction writer, but I see this whole situation in terms of a play, and it could be so dynamic.
Well,
Need
there
a
is
touch
this
of
one.
imagination here to color in what occurred.
Well, this is the one play, and I will find the name of it, and I know that it's online.
Yeah, good.
And probably a better writer, well, I don't know, maybe it's a great play, I shouldn't.
But you did make one very interesting comment.
Well, good, I'm glad I made one.
When you write that you feel as though you're resurrecting the dead. And
Yeah.
I write a lot of fiction, and I always feel when I write about these subjects that I am bringing them back to
Yeah.
life.
Good,
Thank you so much.
thank you. Wait a minute, there are a few other people though.
That's okay. It's okay. It's okay. It's okay. It's okay. It's okay.
There's a couple more. Okay.
What if it's the wrong question? What if the question isn't what would you do, but how did he work himself up to be able to do this? So I'm struck by 2 things. One, you said that they had a relationship beforehand. And I'm thinking about this because we're in a situation here and in Israel as well, where there are splits within families, where politics are getting to the point where, you know what, I can't even talk to you anymore. So how do we mend those rifts here? So he had a relationship beforehand. So he knew this person.
Yeah.
I wonder if it was some random person who came up to the hotel and said, you don't know me from Adam. Will you forgive me? I was part of the Nazi party. Probably not the case.
Right.
And then you put it here at the top here, Dan et kol adam lechaf zchut. And your translation is judge everyone favorably. But the translation is you judge people on the cup of their goodness. People have done bad things and people have done good things. Judge them on the good things that they have done. And the only way you can do that is if you know them personally. So perhaps he did know things about Jung that I certainly don't know about him that allowed him to take that step and listen.
Okay.
There's a question online as well.
Okay, great. Miriam, maybe unmute. You can't unmute? Can she unmute?
Oh, there we go. There we go. Thank you. Thank you. This has been very interesting and very, very rich. My question has to do with Mengele twin Eva Kaur, and she forgave Mengele. Mengele was already probably dead when she did this. And my question for you is, because I don't know how to process Eva's doing this, Jewish law requires that the one to be forgiven has to ask for forgiveness and make penance and so forth, quite a lot of stages. But she claimed that forgiveness was something about her, made her feel better, and she was no longer a victim of the Nazis once she forgave Mengele. So I'm just wondering, what would Jewish law, how do you respond to that kind of reconciliation?
Yeah.
I don't even know what word. Okay. So
no, I think it's very good. I mean, my response to it would be, tell me your name, Regina. I think your point is somewhat akin to that. Namely, what is it that occurs to you if in fact you don't forgive? In other words, to what degree does the anger or hatred that you feel, even if it's justifiable, what's the impact that it has on you? The story you told about your father. And therefore, I mean, I think just on a human level, I won't get into Jewish law, but on a human level, I think it's completely understandable. We'll wait a moment for announcements, but if you have any last comments, we're going to try to bring it to a close. So let's go here. We'll let you make your announcement after the. Yeah, no, I understand. Yes. Yeah, we'll have it.
So I'm thinking about this as kind of who and what Aviv said about them having a relationship prior.
Yes.
Beck had every reason to be annoyed, angry, with this whole intellectual class that blessed Aryan supremacy and enabled and gave the groundwork for it. 2 years after the war ends, you've worked on dividing up where the Jewish treasures, assets are going to be going. You're thinking of the future. You're an intellectual. You may be thinking that this was reconciled in whatever way. What's the play from here? How does the community get served better? It's not just retribution for what's happened in the past, but it is some level of hope for what could happen.
Excellent. So I want to conclude with, I'm not going to let the rabbis off the hook. So I want the two rabbis to make comments on how you understand this. And can we say ladies first? I don't know.
I mean, just to tie this into the bigger context of our whole weekend, what I've really heard you say, even from, Jefferson's quotes on the gates to your book and whether to include a certain person's article to this is, and you're straddling the academic and rabbinic worlds, is this idea of the historical record and the importance of teaching the shades of gray for all of our continued moral refinement, and to not, go so far into cancel culture that we avoid addressing the nuances. And so that's really, for me, that's how all of these are fitting together. It's that we need the records. We have the discussion of taking down the statues and versus a chapter in a book where we're explaining a difficulty. And so this idea of engaging in continued conversation around difficulty, I think, is where we start to learn the lessons.
Right. Thank you.
I actually want to say that the way you approached this by saying, I don't know what I would do, is freeing to me. Because often as a rabbi, people want to know what to do. And I think at a time when there's such polarization and there's such anger, and I know that, I mean, I face questions like this all of the time with someone who's done something terrible. And how do we then find a way to deal with it?
Right.
And that part that so wants to respond simply with anger
Yeah.
and justice is so real. And so to have Leo Baeck, and even though we have no idea, and
Right.
that and we don't know if he forgave, or is there some way to stay connected, to listen, to not let yourself be so driven by your anger. I find that inspiring. I find it touching. I find it challenging. And I think it's something to lift up as a possibility to reflect upon and to be touched by. So thank
Okay,
you.
Thank you. I think both of there's a reason why these two people are rabbis, is what I would say. Let me just end with a story, and then we'll let you make is the announcement connected to this, or is it some, oh, please then make the announcement, and then I'll make a final comment. Here. Oh, thank you.
So
Oh, I didn't
here's-
know the cannon was still here. You're certainly invited to speak as well.
Oh, I said what I would say.
Okay,
So-
thank you.
I see the hope in this way. Right now at Aragon High School, they're putting on the play, the students are putting on the play, The Diary of Anne Frank. This is a generation that is very far removed from the Holocaust. You've mentioned Deborah Lipset.
Lipstadt, yeah.
Lipstadt, yeah. So there's one more performance tomorrow, probably like 2 o'clock or something. I plan to go.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I'm gonna end with just one story. As I've been listening to all of this tonight, I suddenly flashed on a lecture that I once heard Rabbi David Hartman give at the Hartman Institute. And there was a symposium on the issue of tolerance. And Catherine Rorty initially spoke, philosopher, and gave the most brilliant philosophical exposition one could ever hear on tolerance, forgiveness, reconciliation. Then Michael Walzer from the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton spoke. And one of the things that I do remember is he pointed out that when there was ethnic conflict as well as religious difference, the conflicts lasted centuries. They never were reconciled. And then David Hartman got up after these incredibly erudite lectures by these two brilliant academics. Hartman gets up at the time he's 68 years old, and he says, I want to tell you about my first grade teacher. And he describes a woman who was so cruel to him, it was beyond belief. Then he says, let me tell you about my bar mitzvah. So the nicest thing said at my bar mitzvah was that people came up to my mother at the end of the bar mitzvah and said, don't feel bad, you're going to get a lot of nachas from Yoni, meaning his brother. Then he said, let me tell you about being 18 years old and being a first-year student at Yeshiva College. I turn in my first paper, he said, and the professor comes over very kindly and says, listen, we have classes in remedial English for people who are not native English speakers. So he said, by this point, he said, I'm 68 years old. These events occurred 50, 60 years ago. I've won the National Jewish Book Award. I'm a professor at Hebrew University. I'm head of this institute. But then he said, who am I really? He said, the person I am really is that 6, 13, and 18-year-old boy. And he began by saying then, I want to tell you, he said, nobody ever forgets. Said everybody remembers, he said, particularly every bad thing or insult they've ever received in their life. But he said the issue for him in the end, and then he went on to say, speak to the Palestinians and speak to the Israeli Jews. Each one of them has beyond a litany. They have a treasure trove of stories about how badly the other side treated them. And he said, you know what? The stories probably have more than a modicum of truth to them. And he said, the question is, can you live, he said, with what he called an ethic of aspiration? The aspiration that Lomrota called, despite everything that has occurred, that is negative and for which you have justifiable pain. Can you nevertheless go forward? And it relates to the comments that were made here at the end as well. Can you just go forward and say, look, I'm not going to ever get, as it were, justice or a sense of fairness or just a sense of satisfaction from the past. It's going to always remain broken. But the question is, can you have an ethic of aspiration that at least lets you move on in the present and move towards the future? Each of us has to decide how that is done. And I don't think Dr. Hartman, Rabbi Hartman, was trying to suggest that that's an easy thing to accomplish. But nevertheless, it remains for me in my own life, you know, an aspiration. I want to thank all of you for paying such attention tonight. And I hope this was a valuable kind of lesson. And it's something that you'll think about and take with you as you move on. So again, Shavua Tov, thank you for your graciousness. Lovely to be here.
You don't change your clock, you'll either be early or late, right?
One or the other, one or the other. He's picking me up, so I'll be sure to be there.
Okay.
Thank you. It's an interesting thing.
Yeah, that was very thought provoking. I wanted to mention something to you about your lecture yesterday about the so my great uncle was performing an and his he went to HSC